Andreas wants maybe to give a short intro. Where's Andreas? Do you want to give a short intro? No? Fine. Okay. You want? Okay, good. All right. Okay, thank you. No, welcome everyone. Before we start, I'd like to ask you a few questions. See where we are, if you're using Spring Boot already, if you had a look to Spring Boot 2, just to adapt the presentation a bit if I can. So who's not using Spring Boot? Probably easier that way. I have one shy person in the back. Is it really one? Two. Who is not a Java developer in the room? Eric? You? Okay. You're not a Java developer, but you're using Spring Boot. Front end. Front end interested in back end. Okay, makes sense. Who's already using Spring Boot 2? That's 20% maybe, 15%. If you're not using Spring Boot, who's not using Spring Boot 1.5, so using an older version, 1.4, 1.3, etc.? Who's using an older version of Spring Boot? Okay. One shy person again, that's good, very good. Because it's a problem to stay on older versions, especially today since we've released some security fixes. I don't know if you've seen that. By the way, we also released Spring Boot 2.01 today, this afternoon actually. On my way on the train to here with a sticky keyboard. I need to share that story a bit if the demos goes wrong. This morning I had a small problem of putting a big glass of orange juice on my keyboard. Didn't like that too much. So now I have like a bunch of keys that are not really working properly. So if I swear a lot, that's because I'm trying to type something and it doesn't work. Right. So the way I want to do this, I would like to do this, is to first give you a very short overview of Spring Boot 2. Since most of you are using Spring Boot 1.5, you're probably, and 15% of you already using Spring Boot 2, most of you, you're probably interested to know, if you don't know yet, what are the new features and why you should care. That should be really quick. And then what I have in mind is I have an app, very simple app, but demonstrating a few Spring Boot features using 1.5. And I'm going to migrate this app with you to Spring Boot 2 so that you can see, one, the migration process. Of course, it's a very simple migration process. It's not like tons of code, but then you can see the kind of things we've put in place to make that easier for you. So Spring Boot 2, what can you expect? First of all, it's a major release, but it's not only a major release for Spring Boot, it's a major release for the complete Spring portfolio. You've probably heard that Spring Framework had also a major new generation this year, Spring Framework 5. Who knows about Spring Framework 5? The same that are using Spring Boot 2, that's interesting. So in Spring Framework 5, there's a few things that happened. One is a chance for us to migrate to Java 8, finally. So now you need Java 8 to actually use Spring Framework. Spring Framework 4.3, you could use 6, 7, and 8, and you can still do so. But if you decide to go with Spring Framework 5, now you need absolutely Java 8, and you can use 9 and 10. And there are three main new features in Spring Framework 5. One is reactive programming, so it's a new way to develop web applications, a new paradigm. Functional APIs, which has, let's say, somewhat a direct link to that. I can explain that later. And Kotlin support. So who knows about Kotlin? Yeah, fanboys of Kotlin, I knew that. So that's 40%, a bit more than those using Spring Boot 2. That's interesting. Right. So major new releases for the Spring portfolio. So Spring Framework 5, but also Spring Data had its first major release since its inception. So Spring Data was started as a project in 2009. and never had a major release since then. So this is the first major release of Spring Data that you'll get with Spring Boot 2. Spring Security had a major release, Spring Integration had a major release, Spring Batch had a major release. We have the committer in the room. So if you're using Spring Batch and you have some questions, then you can ask the committer firsthand. Right. So Spring Boot 2 will bring basically a major release of the Spring portfolio. It's also a chance for us, major release, to upgrade dependencies. So third-party dependencies that you get using Spring Boot automatically via the dependency management will also be upgraded. So for instance, you'll upgrade to the latest release of Hibernate 5.2. You'll upgrade to the latest release of Timeleaf 3, even though you can use Timeleaf 3 with Spring Boot 1.5 with an override if you want. There's a major release of Flyway, for instance, Flyway 5, etc., etc. So you need to take that into account when upgrading. So that's really about external stuff, so the things that we depend on, the Java version, the framework version, and the portfolio, the other modules versions, basically. In Spring Boot itself, we did a few things. I'm going to show you some of them. One is that we more or less basically completely rewrite the actuator. And don't worry, it's not like you have to change everything in your code. It's mostly about rewrite, restructuring. We split the code into a more logical structure. We've improved the output format a lot. I'll show you that in the demo. So the reason why that smiley is here, I actually wasn't sure to put that, but is because we didn't intend that initially. We started with, okay, we need that feature, okay, we need that feature, we need that feature. Eventually we realized, oh yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, maybe we need to rewrite that then. And maybe we need to rewrite that then. And eventually it was a much larger work than we had anticipated. We've also changed a lot the way the auto configuration works for security. If you're using Spring Boot 1.5, you know that there are several places where security is happening, which was a bit confusing, to say the least. So we've tried to fix that. And we've also improved configuration properties binding, but then I have a dedicated demos for that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Right, so my plan now is to go with the demo if the keyboard works. Do you have any question before I start? No question. Too much French fries already. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. If you can't see something, just scream, because it's very clear on my screen, so I don't always realize that it's more on this one. I have an app which is working 1.5.11. 1.5.11 that was released today as well, by the way. On the train. No, that one I released it on in the morning. That's not true. So it's using like really simple stuff, right? There is an entity, a speaker entity. There's a repository for the speaker. I'm using Spring Data REST so that I can expose the content of my domain object as REST endpoints automatically. It's a web application. It's using the actuator and it's using security. Then I have 2 ways to actually run this app. You can see here if you can. The run config and IntelliJ IDE. I can either run it as with the default settings, and that's going to start H2 in memory and basically insert the data. Or I can use it with the local profile. You can see here, and there's actually a dedicated configuration for the local profile that switches to MySQL. So that's if you don't know that feature yet, profile management is actually quite handy in Spring Boot. You can have default settings in application properties, application YAML if you choose to use YAML for whatever reason. Oh yeah, no, YouTube, I shouldn't say that. Application properties is basically the default stuff. Usually it's good for development environment, right? You want to start the thing without specifying any settings, and you should get something that works on your machine. Then you can add as many profiles as you want with dedicated settings for certain environments. So in this case, I have MySQL running locally on my machine, and I don't know why I call that local. Maybe it's a wrong name, but whatever. And then you can split in IntelliJ. You can split the run config, and you can enable a profile when you start the app here. So basically, I have two ways to start this app. One is the default one, H2 in memory. The other one is MySQL. This app also customizes a few things. It customizes the role that you need to have to access the actuator. So you need to be a hero to access the actuator for some reason. And I didn't like the path of the Earth endpoint, so /Earth, and that gives you an overview if your app is up, if there is some remote services down. I decided I prefer to call that status. Just a customization, like any customization you may want to apply. So I have one running. I don't know which one it is. Go away. So I'm going to start the first one. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Banner, of course. I have also a very simple properties object. That's totally useless. It's just for the purpose of demonstration. Actually, I'm using it, but it's not really important why I'm using it. With two properties, elo.target, elo.delay. I can go here in my application, and basically I have them in the IDE. Maybe you don't know that, but you know about that feature surely, because you must have used it at some point. Who doesn't know about that feature? That pop up with keys? No one. Good. So you've used that for standard Spring Boot properties, but maybe you don't know that you can actually add your own very easily. So the way it works is you create a properties object exactly like we do, and there is a short build step to add to your build script. So I'm going to show you so that you don't wonder what it is. It's basically adding this dependency, and this dependency will generate the necessary metadata at compile time so that the IDE can find your custom properties. Right, so I can type here and have auto-completion, have the default value like any other Spring Boot properties. Right, so the app is running. So let's log in. Oh yeah, should have probably shown the security config. Nothing really super interesting. I have a security config for now with two users, and one of them is a hero, the other one isn't. So it's to demonstrate what happens when you log in as a user. You're not supposed to have access to the actuator. So I can see my status. Must be status, I suppose. Yes. My Earth endpoint, which is on status due to the customization. I can see basically all the endpoint. Nothing really new. It's still a Spring Boot 1.5. All right. So first problem is this. So I've switched to the app to use MySQL instead of H2. And I have to initialize the database, right? And I have a very simple system. You may want to use Flyway or Liquibase, but for the purpose of this demo I've used the simple support in Spring Boot. Then you have to say when to initialize the database. In 1.5 you have a Boolean flag. So yeah, basically what I have to do is set it to true, restart the app, it will create a database, and once the database is created, then flip it back to false. The other option is to have scripts that can detect if things have been created or not, but that complexifies things a lot. So once the database has been created, basically flipping that back to false. That's really annoying. Right, so I guess that's a good overview of what we have in this app. There is a controller here that uses the duration just for the purpose of using the duration. So really not interesting at all, but it's using it. Let's migrate this app to Spring Boot 2. Right, so first thing is, well, changing the version number, not very complex. And this app doesn't use a lot of things. So if you use a lot of hook points in Spring Boot, like if you customize the embedded container in code, you have like an embedded servlet customizer or something like that. You may have to change some of your code because we've harmonized some of those names. I think now it's Tomcat Web Server Customizer. I can't remember the name. But there are APIs in Spring Boot that have changed for the better. Well, we didn't change it just for the fun of pissing you off having to change your code. It was really we meant to actually change that much earlier. We realized the mistakes that we've made in naming and consistency. But we couldn't change that in the 1.x line. So we had to wait. So we had a few things on our plate that we knew we had to do, and we had to wait for 2.0. And the other thing that drove a lot of changes is the support of reactive. So adding the support of reactive, adding the support of Netty, as I'm going to show you after. So being able to have a new ways of developing web applications means that we can't rely on servlet anymore. We can't assume that servlet will be there. Because if you build a reactive web application with Netty, for instance, you have no servlet API. So we had to change a lot of things there to make it work. Right. So that's not what I meant to do. Am I running to one? I'm running to one. So first thing is when you upgrade, you have this. There is some stuff popping up telling you that things have changed. First one is this. Oh, that's very small. So that property is now deprecated and there's a replacement. Oh, that's really, really small. Okay, so the replacement is initialization mode. So spring.datasource.initialization mode, and that's an enum rather than a flag. And the default value is embedded. So you know where I'm going now, right? In Spring Boot 2, if we detect you using an embedded database or in-memory database, we will initialize because you're going to create that database for the process, and it's going to be destroyed anyway. If you are using a production database, then it won't do anything by default, so that you don't have to play with those flags. Actually, yeah, okay, we can remove this. The other one is those two. So one is telling me that I can't change the security configuration of the actuator by properties anymore. So I can't do that anymore. I have to provide my own Spring security configuration instead. So that's one of the problems. So my hero role is not going to be taken into account. And this one is interesting. It's part of the same thing, the same idea of what I've explained with renaming classes and renaming hook points. We've also harmonized the configuration property structure a lot so that it's more consistent. So in this case, this property has been renamed to a different area. Okay, so I can start the app. And then something really bad will happen. I'm not sure actually I can even explain why we've done that, but I can show you at least. So I'm back with my login page. Did I get the exception? No. There you go. Bam. Didn't work. And then Spring Security is screaming at me that I don't have a password encoder. So that's part of the challenge of upgrading to Spring Boot 2. As I explained, you'll get major new releases of a bunch of things. In the case of Spring Security 5, one of the decisions is that you can't have a password in plain text anymore. You need to encode them for security reasons, which seems fair. And there's a workaround. There's a workaround that you can use, but you have to be explicit. So that's the compromise that we have. Is if you really want them to be in plain text, like in this stupid demo, then you need to add something in the front to say, don't apply an encoder for this one, but you have to do it explicitly. So the no-op encoder basically says, use it as plain text. So if I restart this, it should work. Of course, that's not the way you fix this, right? The way you fix this is Spring Security is telling you that having password that's in some location not encoded is a security breach, and you shouldn't do that. And it's been saying that for quite some time, and I think the Spring Security team is definitely right. It goes without saying, but Spring Security 5 is a way for them to enforce that, so to force you basically to migrate and encode password. So if I go here, I should be back on my feet. Okay, I made a typo again. Wonderful. Did I make a typo? Ah, no. There you go. By the way, here are my speakers. Didn't show that previously. So I'm running Spring Boot 2 now with my app, but there's stuff in red in the configuration. So I know that I know two things. I know that thing doesn't work. So the /status doesn't work. So if I go to /status, I have a 4.4. Doesn't exist. And the security configuration that I've added won't work. So the fact that I'm asking for the user to have the hero role, that's not working obviously because the property is red. There is one thing that we've done also in Spring Boot 2 for the actuator is to rationalize all endpoints under a common prefix that you can configure. And the prefix is actuator. So if I'm invoking the info endpoint, that's the info endpoint empty by default, but I can also go to the earth endpoint. And you can see the earth endpoint replies, right? It should be status because of my customization, but my customization does not apply at the moment, so that's what you get. And I can also get the environment, or not. So I want to explain a little bit the rationale behind that. It's a bit forward-looking because I'm going to, it's really highly related to the way security has been redesigned in Spring Boot 2. We've really thought a lot about what the out-of-the-box experience should be and how we can be gentle with you and yet prevent you to do stupid things if you don't know what you're doing because you're upgrading or because you're starting with Spring Boot or for whatever reason. So one thing we've done is that by default, if you don't do anything, only two endpoints are being exposed, the info endpoint and the earth endpoint. That's the only two endpoints that we will expose by default. So anything that exposes the environment allows you to do a thread dump of your app, something that shows you the metrics of your app, something that allows you to trace HTTP requests, so all the things that the actuator can do that you know from Spring Boot 1.5. All those features will be disabled by default. We don't expose that. And it's up to you to actually say, these are the endpoints that I want to expose. So we've, as you'll see quickly, we have now new properties to allow you to tune that. But let's go back to the original problem, those red things. You may have, I mean, it's a simple project with 3 keys. You may have 100 of keys. Probably not, but you may have a lot of keys. So what we've done is we've built a tool to help you migrate. it's called properties migrator. And if I add that to this app and I restart, it should do something for me. Right. So this app is doing this dependency, sorry, is doing two things. One, it's looking for keys that it knows it can replace. So if going back to the status one, if you can read in the back, but I'm going to show you. Whoa, sorry. Trying to make that bigger, but I don't know how to do it. So anyway, there is something telling you, okay, deprecated, doesn't work. C, and then there is another key, which is a new key in Spring Boot 2. So we have that information. The idea is just reading that from Spring Boot itself. We have that information. So when the application starts, those metadata can be read by this new dependency I've added. Then we can scan if you're using, by any chance, a key that's not working anymore, and if there is a replacement that we can use. In this case, we can. So it's giving you the replacement, and note it's also giving you the location of the key and where that key is being defined. So this is the file, this is the line, and it's telling you the new key is this. So that's the first thing it does. But it not only it does that, it actually replaces the key at runtime for you automatically. So if I go back to the Earth endpoint, I have to log in again. I don't have it. But if I type status, remember that's the customization that I've done in my app. It's actually working. So for things it can replace, it tells you what to do, and it also replaces it. It does not replace it in the file. I got asked that a lot. Can you also replace in YAML files? No, we can't do that. That's an interesting question. Then what do you do if you have already defined a new key? The process is that you add this at the very beginning, like I'm doing. So if you go to the migration guide on the wiki, it will tell you first thing, add that, like I've done. Then it will give you information. If you miss that for some reason and you do the migration after, the interesting thing is that it will still, so it will work, but it will still give you that warning. So you know that you have something to actually remove in this case. So it's not going to crash or something. It's going to work. Actually, it's an interesting idea. Wait. It will not work if you have the new key with a different value. So if you have a new key with a different value, what we do is when we replace the property, we automatically replace it with a higher precedence. So our modification takes precedence to what you've done, because I mean we want that to work, right? So actually, it's a very good question. So you may go back to your previous key, basically, if you do this. But it's kind of a weird scenario, I think. Yes? So what happens if you use all keys at environment properties? What it basically does, it takes the value that you've defined, and it just maps it with the new key. So whatever value you've defined will be the value of the new key. Oh, I didn't get the question. Okay. What if you use the old key as an environment properties? That's your question. Yes, you'll get the information that in your environment you have this key and you need to change it. But it won't tell you the line because there's no line. But it will tell you it's coming from system properties or environment properties or whatever, or command line switches. So if you set with a command line switch, it will tell you on the command line you've done that. It shouldn't be this. It should be this. First thing it does. So it replaces at runtime, so just so that you have the experience, you know that your things are still working. You still have to replace that, so I'm going to do this. Bam. So if you use an IDE with good Spring Boot support, IntelliJ IDE has very good support, STS has very good support. There is some support in NetBeans. Who use NetBeans? Okay, and he's ashamed, so yeah, there you go. Right, so you can replace automatically. So IntelliJ IDE is doing the same thing, right? Well, the IDE, sorry. It's reading the metadata, it knows it can replace, so it gives you an inspection where it can replace. First thing, replacing, giving you a warning. That's here. Second thing is you're actually using something and there is nothing we can do about that, right? Because that property is either we can't replace it automatically because the type has changed, actually. Let me do something here. Because I remove it, but shouldn't have removed it. There you go. So let's restore that and see what happens. By the way, the app is still starting. It's just that that report is added at the end. Right. Because, okay, yeah. It doesn't show it because that profile is not active. So let's switch to the MySQL database. There you go. So you've seen that the warning report is gone now because I've changed the property. The one that I can change, I've changed it, so the warning is gone because you have effectively fixed that part of the configuration. The second part is things that we can't fix for you. So that one, I can tell you which key you need to use. So I told you that initialize now is initialization mode. And I've told you previously that it used to be a Boolean flag, now it's an enum. So before it was true and false, now it's embedded always, never. So it gives you more flexibility. But we can't really replace, actually we could, but not in a generic way. We have no way to know that false is actually never. We could like do some crazy things, but we don't like to do too much magic because magic is a word I don't like. It's been used too much, especially with Spring Boot. So we basically tell you, this is the new key. The type is not compatible, so please read the doc and fix it. Then if you go on that key, you'll see that, okay, these are the values I can use. The other one is yet another use case, is you're using a key, so you're using a feature of Spring Boot 1.5, and that feature is gone. So either it's gone because you can't configure that via properties anymore, or maybe it's gone for other reasons. It's being replaced by a callback in code, or maybe you don't need to configure that because it's done automatically, I don't know. And then we're giving you a reason. We're giving you a hint. Security auto-configuration is no longer customizable. So what you have to do in this case is it's a warning that you have to actually look at the migration guide, what you need to do. And in this case, I'm going to show you how you need to fix this. So let's remove this. Actually, let's remove this and see what happens with our app running now. So I'm going to log in as a user. Remember, a user is not supposed to see the actuator. Actually, it can't see because it's not enabled, sorry. So let's fix that. So let me first fix the other problem. Because the security has been vastly simplified, so you can't say, okay, if you want to access the actuator, you need to have that role. That feature is gone. So what we do now is, rather than having security scattered over several places, you may have some stuff in properties, you may have some stuff in code. Then we try to glue that together and do what you expect us to do, which is not always easy. We've changed that in Spring Boot 2. There's only one security auto-configuration, only one. And as soon as you express an opinion, we back off completely. The opinion that we have is you need to be authenticated to access anything, but the usual static location. So if you use if you have a front end and you're loading JavaScript images and stuff like that, then you can access those anonymously by default. But anything that's actually touching the server, you have to be authenticated. That's the default opinion. What that means is, because we don't have this role thing anymore for the actuator, if you upgrade and you're not careful, someone that doesn't have the role, the hero role in my case, could actually access some endpoints you don't want them to access. So that's why we disable the we disable the endpoints except earth and info. That's what you see here in this property. So now we have an include-exclude system for actuator endpoints, where you can specify the ones that you want to include. You can also add an exclude to if there's a specific one you don't want to expose, and you can use star if you want to include them all. So star is a way for you to tell, okay, give me everything. And okay, it's a bit ugly because the JSON plugin is the JSON plugin is disabled in incognito mode, but you can see now that my user can access that endpoint. It should not, because remember, we want only heroes to access the endpoints. So that's why it's not exposed by default. But now I've taken a decision to include everything. So my next step is actually to fix the configuration. Didn't have to shut it down. So if you've been using the security features in Spring Boot, you know that we do a lot for you that you can in 1.5, that you can configure with properties like, okay, I just want that role for the actuator. I would like also to have this, and we basically try to gather all that. The downside of us backing off completely if you express an opinion is that you have to redo that yourself, right? So all those customizations that were done automatically via properties are gone, and you have to write that yourself, which can be very painful. So what we've done is not only basically throw you in the water. What we've done is we've implemented a few security-related utilities so that you can very easily redo what the auto configuration does, right? So the idea is we are giving you tools you can use to apply what we previously were doing with properties, and then you can add your stuff in the same file. So it looks like this. The new utility I'm talking about are those 3 lines. So the difference now is that you can see your complete configuration. Again, very simple, but you may have more complex use cases. So the security of your app, the security of your endpoints, and the actuator security are in one file, in one location. So if you want to know what the security policy for your app is, you have one place to look. And it's not something that's partially in properties, partially in that hook point, and partially in that other hook point. Only one file. So in this one, what I'm basically saying is these two are public, so anybody can access. All the other endpoints, so the two any endpoints, so it doesn't matter if in Spring Boot 2.1 we add 3 new endpoints. If you claim any other endpoint, they will be added automatically. If you're using a third-party libraries, I've heard a few actually already migrated to Spring Boot 2. That's quite interesting. And that library actually offers dedicated endpoints, or you have endpoints in your own infrastructure for some reason. They will be taken into account automatically. So you don't have to change your code because you have an endpoint on your own. We'll detect that and we'll apply it. Then there is the thing I was telling you about static resources. So let me show you the back. So if for instance you decide that for static resources you need a certain role or you need to be authenticated, You just use the feature in Spring Security and you express that. And then for the rest, you need to be logged in. So there you add basically the rules for your own endpoints. So if I'm in the admin area, I need to have that rule. If I'm in the API area, I need to have whatever rule. But you only have one file. And if we apply that configuration, then we'll be back to what we had in 1.5. So those two are public. The other one needs the role. And you can still access static resource anonymously, as it was the case with the default security autoconfig. Questions? Don't ask me crazy questions about security because I know nothing, but go ahead. Sorry? Isn't that this line? Oh, I see what you mean. That's a feature of Spring Security that I'm not using, but you could use like, and I mean, the feature that you use with Spring Security can be used with that utility, because the key here is that thing, so the utility that basically where we create a matcher on the fly for you based on your settings, gives you back a standard Spring Security builder. So anything you can do with Spring Security, you can still do it with this mechanism. It's exactly the same thing. So the thing that it returns is really the Spring Security usual object. So all the methods that you use will still be available. Right, I can see security is like passionate, I know. I'm deep patient for that too. Right, let's switch to some more candy stuff. Durations. So if you look at the Spring Boot appendix that lists all the properties that we offer in 1.5, you'll see that we have a bunch of them that are related to duration, so a period of time. And you'll see that because we integrate with so many third-party libraries, some decide to use milliseconds by default. Some of them, for some reason, use seconds. No idea why, but they decide to use seconds. Some of them would like to offer you more flexibility with a pattern that you can use to basically describe the duration. And before Java 8, so Java 8 has introduced a duration class, which is really helpful. Except the format. I don't know if you've seen the format of duration, but it's crazy. It's an ISO whatnot standard. I mean, I never understand. Let's actually show you. Do I have that on the Java doc? I don't know. Format. Should have a parse something. Yes. There you go. So PT20.3345S is 20,345 seconds. I guess I can use to it. Oh, there's minus and plus also, which is quite interesting. There. Anyway, I thought that was funny. That's a format I never managed to parse. But duration is super interesting because if you look at the appendix, you'll see that every single properties we actually tell you in which unit the duration. Most of the time it's milliseconds because like 90% of them are milliseconds. But when it's seconds, we basically have to tell you in each case whether it's milliseconds or seconds, which is what I've replicated here in my simple example. So it would be much nicer if you could write this. And let's say, rather than giving 3,000 milliseconds, you write 3 seconds. It's easier to read in your code. Then you actually return a duration and take a duration. And then the nice thing is that you can do this, right? Because it's a duration. So you don't have to specify the unit anymore. And the code that uses can use it like this. But there's more to it. If you decide to use that again in your own code, you get this 3S, which is a bit more readable than PT, whatever in uppercase. Yeah, format in uppercase already. So anyway, sorry. So this is a format, very much more limited format, of course. I mean, I'm bashing the standard. I should probably not, because it allows you to express duration in very detail. Like if you want to have like 2 days and you need to remove 2 seconds of that, it's actually very easy to express that. So the spec is going much further than our needs. Our need is simply to express a simple duration. So the format that we support is basically you put the amount, and then you put the unit at the end. So you can write 3 seconds, 3000 ms for milliseconds. You can write H for hour, D for days. So you can very easily describe what the duration is. And that's actually understood by the thing that generates the metadata. So you've seen I've used duration of second 3. We actually look at that and we generate the default value for you. So if you want to change that, so if you want to make super clear that the default is millisecond, then you write it with milliseconds, right? So you say of milliseconds, the right value this time, and then the default value will express what the default unit, sorry, is. Where am I? For backward compatible reason, if you don't provide a unit, what happens? Well, we will bind with a default unit. The default unit is milliseconds. But if for some reason your property used to have seconds, and you want to make sure that on upgrade, if the user only provide the value and not the unit, there is a way to teach the binder what the duration unit is. So you can write something like, let's assume it was seconds in this case. You can write something like this, and we will, if we have only a long, we will bind that as a number of seconds in this case. So it's pretty complete. Right, so let's use that stuff. In a very smart way, I must add. My app is not running. I'm sure it won't be happy. There we go, not very happy. New feature, origin. You've seen that already with the properties migrator. I just want to show you that it's something we use also in other places. So my LO delay, not a duration, is not a duration. LO delay with the value, it's basically telling you that it can't convert that value to a duration. It's not a duration, so you can figure that out yourself. But the nice thing, it's actually telling you where the property is defined. It's telling you in that file at that line, you've made a mistake. It's the same thing as if it's an environment variables, of course. It will tell you it's an environment variable, so check your environment. It's a command line switch, so check the way you've started the application, etc., etc. So let me fix that. Wow, the one almost doesn't work anymore. I've stopped the app. Oh yeah, of course it can't work since duration is invalid. Okay, so I have an app. It's using 1 second for the delay. I want to show you yet another feature. Who doesn't know DevTools? Because I've been using that a lot already. Who doesn't know DevTools? Don't be shy. You can't say you don't know DevTools. You're not allowed to say that. You don't know DevTools? Are you serious? Wow. You need to, yeah, okay. No, okay, so I need to stop that, because otherwise every time I ask a question, nobody will reply. Sorry, I'm not going to say anything. Who doesn't know DevTools? There you go, 4 more. All right. So DevTools is a feature in Spring Boot that brings interesting development features in your IDE. So the way it works is you add this dependency, right? And when you add this dependency, a few things will happen. One is there is something in your app that's going to watch the class path, and it will watch the class path for changes. And every time it will see a change, so a class file has changed, or property file has changed, or template has changed, which is quite interesting, then it will do something about your app. So if you've changed a template, I don't have a template here. Yeah, okay, maybe I need to also explain the other feature. So the second feature that Spring Boot does is it integrates with live reload. Who doesn't know about live reload? I'm not going to say anything. Okay. Who knows about live reload? Okay, let's wake up a bit. Thank you. So for the few of you who don't know about live reload, it's nothing to do with Spring. It's actually something that allows you to send commands to your browser. So you have a live reload server, and you have a plugin on your browser. So the plugin is free, and that's the little thing here. And what the plugin will do, it will basically connect the browser to the server, to the live reload server, and then the server can send commands to the browser. And the most basic command you can think of is please refresh. Okay? The server, as far as I know, is actually quite expensive. That company is selling that server solution. But the nice thing is the communication protocol is open source. So what we've done is we've created our own super small live reload server that only supports one command, which is refresh, and it's part of DevTools. Okay? So when you add that dependency and you start the app, two things happens. Well, more than that, but let's restrict to two things. It's not Spring Boot 2 specific, by the way, so if you're using 1.5, you can use it now. One is it watches your file, and two, it's starting your live reload server so that you can connect. So let me connect to it. So damn, I'm connected. The plugin is a bit weird, but I can connect. So let me show you something. So the environment, okay? I have the environment here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to command this. Remember, if I command this, what happens is that only 2 endpoints are being exposed. So if I go back to my browser, gone. I didn't refresh the browser, right? So what happens is I change a config, I save. The thing that watches files figure out that the file has changed. Not the source file in your ID, the thing on the class path, the timestamp has changed. And then it takes a decision. Do I need to restart the app or not? If it's a template, so if you're a front-end developer and you're working on your time leaf, mustache, or whatever templates, it's actually not going to do anything. It's just going to tell the browser refresh because that person actually changed the UI, and your UI will refresh with the same server. And you can configure which part of your projects are actually considered to be templates and which one are considered, well, the other ones are considered things that needs the application to restart. So in the case of the config, if you've changed the config, well, we don't know, so we restart the app. But the interesting part is the app is restarting, but the process doesn't. Okay? Which means that your VM is hot. All the caches are still there. So if you look at the restart is actually super fast. Where is the restart? There you go. Usually 1, 2, 3 seconds. Of course, if you have a bunch of things that happens on startup, like you're calling web services and whatnot, don't do that. But if you happen to work on a weird project that does that, it will still do it. Because we're not doing any magic like JRebel, and we're not going to guess what we have to do. We just restart the thing. But we restart it in a way that's actually quite effective. So if I actually uncommented out this one, and I save, then it should do something. If it doesn't, that's because my keyboard is okay. There we go. That's DevTools. You've learned something probably today. Yes. Right, so what I wanted to show you about DevTools is another interesting features is, you know that using Spring Boot, when you add configuration to your app, it will potentially impact the auto configuration. So if you are relying on something, and then you tune some part of the config, and then something changes, you may wonder why that has changed. That's a bit annoying because you don't understand. I've changed that, and all of a sudden, I don't have this anymore. It's quite annoying. Or you've defined a bean, and because we look for that bean in a certain auto configuration and react to that, then we want to configure something, and you're not aware of that, so you don't understand why it's changing. So let's give you a very simple example to showcase that. I'm going to actually disable GMX support in Spring Boot. So there's a property to do that. But you can relate to any other property. So the new feature in Spring Boot 2 is when you do that, actually you get something like this. So you get a delta of the autoconfig. So we tell you what has changed since the last time the application has started. So you can, if you change something and you save, the application restarts and something is not right, you can look there. And it will tell you, okay, I can't expose GMX metrics for the data source anymore because this is false. It's no longer true because you have disabled it. The GMX auto configuration is not applied anymore, and there is no GMX bean exporter. So there's a bunch of things that were positive before and are negative now. You have the same. You have the same for positive. So if you had something that enables something, it will end up here. And the same for exclusions and unconditional, but probably that one actually may not change much. Right? We want to improve that in two ways in the line, the 2.x line. Not sure we'll have the time for 2.1, but that's definitely something in 2.2 we would very much like to do. One is we would like to make sure this works if you stop the process. So right now, the way it works is there is another configuration in the VM. You restart using DevTools, and then we diff basically the previous auto configuration report with the new one, and we output that. We would like that to make it persistent, so that store that in some file, so that when you change something, even if the app is not running, and you run it again and it fails, it will tell you the delta, so you can understand why it's failing. That's one thing. Two things is second thing is we want to give you more information. So for instance, what we want to tell you is if you've made a change in your class path, so if a library has upgraded to a different version, or if you added a library, or if you've removed a library, we want to give you the delta as well. So that when you start the app, either it works and there is something that works, or doesn't work, or works differently, then you can see, oh, I've added that library which enabled that auto configuration which has that effect, so that you can immediately see what is going on. And the third thing is we want to add also the environment. So if you change something in the environment, we give you a delta. So you've seen I've actually added a property. You couldn't see that I've added a property there. I mean, you know because you've done it. I mean, I've typed the property and I saved, so I know what I've just done like 2 seconds ago. But with a persistent support, you may not remember what you've changed. So it's actually interesting that you have a list as well. Right, an hour on a Thursday evening? Thursday, yes. Not dead, as far as I can see. Somewhat awake, depending. Questions on that? Is there some? I have a few more things to show, but I want to focus because it's a bit like when you're driving, right? If you drive and you know you have 80 minutes drive, the beginning is okay. And the shorter you get to the 80 minutes, the more annoying it is. And you just want to exit your car because you're fed up. I'm sure you know what I mean. It's a bit, it's the same with presentation. When you start like willing to go to the bathroom of having some beers or whatever, then you're not listening anymore. So is there something specifically that you would like to see that I didn't cover yet? I can't cover everything because I don't know everything, of course, but I can do my best depending on the topic. Uh, uh, okay, we can try your ID, maybe. Yes, I knew that was coming. Right. So there is micrometer. So that's actually the metric system in Spring Boot 2, which is completely different. Interested by that? To hear a bit? Yes. Nobody said Kotlin already. I'm actually quite surprised. Kotlin is just a language, you know, so no need to spend too much time on it. Right. So for that, I have something here. I'm going to check out because I'm too lazy to type it. In Spring Boot 1.5 or 1.x, there is a metric system that you can use to register mainly two types of meter, counters and gauge. So counters are things that value you can increment or decrement, and gauge basically record a single value, and value that changes over time. And there is a metrics actuator endpoint that you can use to see those metrics in memory. So, for instance, I don't know, the current amount of memory that's being used, the number of threads that are being active, the number of threads that the VM has started so far. Or it could be anything that you've defined yourself, right? So in your own code, you can inject counter service or gauge service. And you can increment the counter, for instance, every time you receive a message for some system. And then you can see on the metrics endpoint how many messages this application has received so far, and you see that increasing. That's the part where you actually define the metrics and they're being collected by Spring Boot. And there's another part also in Spring Boot, 1.x still, is the exporters. So you can define a bean of type metrics exporter, and what it will do, it will take the metrics that you have in your system and it will expose that into some monitoring system. So for instance, one very basic is to expose that to a JMX domain. So you can connect with JConsole and you can see the metrics of your Spring Boot app in JMX. Of course, you may want to use something a bit more advanced, StatsD, Prometheus, whatever. So that's what you have in Spring Boot 1.x. While we were working on Spring Boot 2, there is a new project that was initiated called Micrometer. So let me show you that. Micrometer.io. Do I have internet? Yes. So Micrometer, there is actually a very good way to describe it is, I'm sure you all know SLF4j, the logging facade. So basically you have some logger in your code and no dependency to the logging system whatsoever. You just add a binder and that thing will talk to the logging system. So if you're fed up with logback for some reason, you just change log4j2 and the config, and all your config goes to log4j2. Well, Micrometer is exactly that, but for metrics. So you get an API that's independent of any vendor, where you can define the meter, define the structure, define their type. Then you use the API to record values, basically. And then you have a registry implementation that exposes that to the outside. So in a way, it's somewhat what we have in 1.x, except this library goes much, much beyond what Spring Boot 1.x provides. So these are the monitoring system it integrates with. So the Netflix Atlas, the Datadog, Ganglia, Graphite, Influx, JMX, New Relic, Prometheus, SignalFX, StatsD, Wavefront, the next release of Micrometer 1.1, they actually intend to add support for Elasticsearch, and I forgot the other ones, but a couple more. So it's really a vivid project. There's actually quite a lot of things going on there. And it's outside Spring Boot. You can use that without Spring if you want. Don't do that. Everybody wants to, yeah, kidding. So what's new in Spring Boot 2 is basically we've replaced the counter service, gauge service, and this API to use Micrometer. So the advantage for you, well, you have to change a bit of your code, but the advantage for you is that all the knowledge for all the monitoring system, you'll basically get that for free in your Spring Boot app. So the number of systems that it integrates with is one of the upsell compared to Spring Boot 1. The other one is the way metrics are being organized. So in Spring Boot 1.x, it's hierarchical. So basically, the key of the metric provides all the information about the metrics. So you have like something http.request.200.path equals 25. That means you got 25 hit on /path that led to a 200, for instance. So everything is in the key. Micrometer has taken a different approach, which is much more flexible, which is dimensional metrics, where you have a name to categorize the metrics, and then you can add tags to it. So you have a tag that's called path, will give you the path. You can have a tag called status, which is the status. So it allows you to do combinations when you search for certain things. How can you get started is I have this very simple demo where there's not much really. What I've added is I've added the registry for primitives, which is one of the monitoring system you may want to use, or if you have a Datadog account, you can use Datadog. And in the case of primitives, the way it works is when you start primitives actually calls you. It will call you and get information in certain formats. So you need to provide an endpoint so that primitives can actually scrap the data. Fortunately for you, you don't have to do that. We got you covered, no surprise there. And in this case, there is a primitives endpoint that you can use. So just for the purpose of the demo, I just made that public so that I don't have to mess with user and password. But of course, security is important, so it's a demo. I'm going to start primitives. I have some script here. And I'm going to start something else called Grafana, which allows you to take the data and actually display that in a nice dashboard. Going to start the app. So the obvious side effect of migrating to Spring Boot 2, of course, is every metrics that we used to provide in 1.x, you'll get them with a new format without changing anything. That's one. And to all the standard metrics, well, not all of them, but most of them that Micrometer supports, you'll also get them. So you'll get new metrics. So for instance, if you know the Ikari connection pool, it's actually quite fast connection pool, yeah. Ikari actually has already now Micrometer support in it. So there are other projects that are interested by Micrometer, and they provide out-of-the-box support for Micrometer. And of course, what we do is we rely on that. So if you use a data source in your app, or several data sources, it doesn't matter, and they use Ikari, then we detect that and we export the Ikari-specific metrics for you automatically. We export things about the embedded server. We expose plenty of things about the VM. So Micrometer, they've spent a lot of time to give you interesting statistics about garbage collection, for instance. So if all goes well, I must have my Grafana dashboard here somewhere. There you go. And I should have, it's not the one I meant to look at, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Then you get those cool, I mean, like NASA-style dashboard with plenty of interesting information. So it's I can again. you can basically monitor the state of your process if your VM is under pressure. You've seen that quickly because I'm not ashamed to say that I steal from someone else. I've actually closed the cities API tab because there is no cities in my app. It's a dashboard that I took from another webinar that we've done, where Phil Webb actually did that for the Spring Boot 2. When Spring Boot 2 was released, we had a webinar online, and you can actually look it up. It's the code is on GitHub and the video is on YouTube already. So what he has done to better show with more details is have a cities API, that's the speaker API in the case of my app, and then added a few metrics there about what that API is doing, and then showing that in a dedicated dashboard, right? So if you use 1.x, it's about you used to inject counter service, engage service, and do things with it. Now in 2, you inject the meter registry and you create micrometer meters. And you can export that in whatever system and see that in this dashboard. So that's the kind of feature. The interesting bits in this case is it's a completely different project that we integrate with, solely focused on metrics. So you can expect much more features than the ones that we have currently in Spring Boot 1.x. Right. Anything else you'd like me to cover? We're close to the 80 minutes drive. It's a bug. Yes, it's a bug. Thank you for noticing we have a bug. It's a bug. I've actually noticed that bug today. And we had a discussion. Actually, it's something we tried to fix previously before 2.0 final, and some weird condition that doesn't really work the way we want, so we need to revisit that. But yes, it's a problem. Actually, the problem here is, just to maybe give a bit more context than just joking. In my app, I have some I have expressed some information about users, right? I'm saying I want a hero user with that password, a user with that password, etc. Spring Boot has a feature that if you put Spring Security on the class path and you don't say anything, then we need to actually apply security. Otherwise, something is wrong, right? So we need to lock everything up, like I've explained. You need to log in, and then if you log in, you have access to everything, unless you start providing your own security configuration. But you still need to log into that app, right? If you haven't done anything. So there is actually I'm doing a joke with that, and I can't make that joke anymore. Anyway, let's pretend you haven't seen this. So the way it works is I usually ask the audience what the default username and password is. It's actually quite funny, because you need to log into this app. So you need to know the user, you need to know the password somehow, the one that the one that works, since you don't provide any opinion. So I get usually Spring Boot. I usually get also Scott Tiger, some Oracle fans. So I get plenty, admin, user. But the bottom line is we can't really give you a default username and password, because if we did, then we had to write that in the documentation somewhere, and everybody could see it. And if you're not careful and you push that app, then someone else can log into your app, right? That's not what you want. So what we do is, on startup, we generate a password, which is really long, and that password changes every time you restart the app. So the only way to log into the app, let's say I didn't express any opinion. Actually, I can do that now. It's more clear. Where is my security config? There you go. Done. So I haven't expressed anything. So if I restart this app, then the password is this. But if I change some code, right, and DevTools restart the app, the password will change again. So the reason why we generate a very long password and it changes every time is so that it bugs you. It annoys you so much that you have to do something about it, which is what we want. So then you start reading the documentation and you know how to define. Actually, that's not what you're supposed to do. It's a demo again. But you could use LDAP, JDBC, or whatever store to have your passwords. And the bug is we're supposed to see that you've written that, but we don't for some reason. But if you expose an authentication manager bean and there's a few more options, then we detect that properly and the log goes away. So it's not supposed to be logged. That's the bug, basically. No. So the problem is the auto configuration doesn't detect that you've configured Spring Security. So it logs it, but that's the bug. Later it realizes that it's the case and it doesn't do anything. The problem is the thing that logs and the thing that creates the authentication manager are two separate things. Yes. Okay. So repeat the question. Talking to a manager or someone that basically decide how much money we're going to spend on a project, why or what should we tell him, or how should we convince him, if I understand the question, that we have to migrate to Spring Boot 2. So why should you invest time to upgrade to Spring Boot 2? So there's a few aspects of that question. The first one is Spring Boot is really an application platform, application development platform. So it's not only what Spring Boot does, but if you choose to use the dependency management, it's all the third-party libraries that you use. So you use a certain, if you use JPA, for instance, you use a certain versions of Hibernate. If you use the embedded server, you use Tomcat, Jetty, and Dotto, whatever server you've chosen. And each of those have security problems, potentially. So if you have an application that's exposed to the outside, that's the first thing. If you're stuck on one version, at some point we will stop providing support for it. And we will stop even after some time fixing security issues in it. We will warn you, of course, about that. So as a matter of fact, today we've exposed 3 security issues that got reported to us that we fixed. So you have the fix in 1.5.11 and 2.01. But if you're using Spring Boot 1.4, for instance, we haven't backport those security fixes there. Actually, the security issues are not in Spring Boot itself. They are in Spring Framework and Spring Data, I think, I think maybe not only Spring Framework. So if you use a previous generation of Spring Boot, you can't use a new generation with Spring Framework with it. That goes without saying, because they are tightly integrated together. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you don't care about the project, and the project is running, are you going to still provide upgrade? Are you going to add features to that project? That's really the key, in my opinion. So if the security by itself, I think, is a good reason to upgrade. But the fact is, if you implement new features, like for instance, if you want to benefit from those new metrics, you can't really do that with an older version. So that's really the two. I mean, it's nothing I think related to Spring Boot itself. It's a question you may ask with anything. Why, if you have WebSphere 6, why do you need to upgrade it? It's running on old version of specs, so if you want to use a new feature of the spec, you can't. That's exactly the same problem. So it's really about how much time you're going to invest in this application, and if you care about security. Yes. Yes. So the question is, when will Spring Cloud be ready to support Spring Boot 2? So I'm assuming that the person who asked the question is asking for a GA release, because it already does, in a non-GA fashion. So if you go, interesting, if you don't know about that stuff, start of Spring.io. Everybody knows start of Spring.io if you've seen Josh in your life once. Start of Spring.io is a way for you to get started with a new project. I haven't shown you that actually, but it's actually quite interesting. So quickly, for those who don't know. So it's a service. You can you can choose your build system, your language. There is Kotlin there. You can choose your Spring Boot generation. And then you can shop for dependencies, right? So you can say, I want to build a web application with JPA. I want an H2 database. I want some REST endpoints. I want security. And then you click Generate Project here, and it gives you a zip with an empty project with a build file that's best practice. So you can import that in your IDE and start coding. If you don't like to do that, because you need to extract a zip and open that in your IDE, that's really annoying, I know. 2 steps. You can actually do that right from the IDE. So actually this service is integrated in all 3 major Java IDEs. I'm showing IntelliJ IDE, but if you use Eclipse, they have support for that, and NetBeans has support for that too. So you'll see the same wizard, and then you can search for web, H2, etc., and you click next, and it will open a new window with the project, and you can get started. So that's start.spring.io. And start.spring.io also, I'm going to answer the question in a minute. No, I'm not answering the question now. If we go to info, there's an interesting piece of information where we basically tell you, because we have to know that, we basically tell you which version of Spring Boot is compatible with which version of other items in the portfolio. So if you have an existing app, you're not using start.spring.io to upgrade an existing app because you don't need to get started, basically. Then you can go there, and if you upgrade the Spring Boot version, you know which version of Spring Cloud, for instance, you have to use. So in this case, the latest one, which is 2.0, is Finchley M9, which is the latest release. So I know it's not the question the person has asked, but if you want to use Spring Cloud today with Spring Boot 2, you need to use Finchley M9. There is an RC1 of Finchley that's actually scheduled. I can't promise any date. You know the date? Okay. That's the same information that I have. So this week or next week is what I had as well. So that's the RC1, and then they have a phase of stabilization. So I'm expecting April, May, we'll have a final release of Spring Cloud using Spring Boot 2. That's the answer, I think, of the question. I need to read that? Does Spring Boot 2 support Java 10? Yes. Yes. You're saying like that? But the answer is yes. Okay, well, maybe okay, let me show you something then. Might not do that because actually the 10 build is red now, but it's not supposed to be red. It's red because there is a glitch. There is a glitch in one test. But we have a CI for Java 8, Java 9, as you can see here, and Java 10. So pretend the red box is green, and that's the answer. Seriously, so every commit we test on Java 8, Java 9, Java 10. Something that may not be known, but we also test all kinds of application server. In case you're wondering. So if you choose to deploy your Spring Boot application as a WAR file, you want to deploy that to WebSphere Liberty, for instance, we actually test every commit we test that it's working. And we do that for a bunch of other application servers. I can't have the list in mind, but the most obvious ones, we test them. So we officially at 85 minutes in our drive, some roadblock or something on our way. We close to the cake and the beers. But I'm happy with questions, so yeah. So the question is, can I say something about reactive? I can, but then the 85 minutes drive will become 90 minutes probably. So who like super interested about that stuff? I mean, it's super interesting, but maybe you don't know about it, maybe you do. Maybe it's something I should do on the side for those that are really interested while the other ones are eating the cake, I don't know. Do you want to have some quick introduction to reactive? You have to. Who doesn't want to have an introduction to reactive? Okay. So let me try to do that very quickly. And if you feel it's taking too long, then I'll shut up and we'll have some beers and cake. Reactive, in a nutshell. So if you look at an app nowadays, the apps are more and more distributed. They have more and more services. Your server on the center is your application, right? So what do you have nowadays? You have like very powerful machines with a very good internet connectivity. And what you want to provide to your users is the better user experience, right? So if something changed on the service, you want to notify them. They don't have to refresh anything. Like they get live data on the screen. That's what you want to provide. But that actually has some side effects on the server because those servers need to maintain state and actually push that information to those machines. Then you have the problem with mobiles, a lot of them, and some of them on very crappy connections, right? So someone can probably tell me what happens if you're on a slow network and you try to reach something and it doesn't work. What do? Refresh. Yes. So you do refresh. And what do you do when you do refresh? You're actually issuing a new request on the dear server. And that's the side on the left. The side on the right, more and more distributed. So you're calling more and more services. It's more, and some of those services may be slow or maybe not reliable too much. And if you combine all those effects, that's your server. Okay? So that's today. Doesn't mean that with the tool that we have today, so the non-reactive one, you can't build an app, of course. You can. And you can also scale with very large volume. But for some use cases, you may benefit from a different mechanism. And this mechanism is going reactive. And one thing I need to tell about that, it's not really about pure speed. It's really about stability and scalability. So what that means is if all of a sudden you have plenty of new connections coming in, your server doesn't go down. That's the idea. So your service scale it's more stable. It's not like it's faster. It's actually not faster on a per request. Quickly, the difference between reactive and non-reactive. If you know that stuff and it's boring, tell me, because then I can skip to the interesting part. So the regular servlet MVC-based approach is you have one thread per request. That's the problem with the refresh, right? Because if you hit refresh, you need to allocate a new thread on the server to handle that new request. And if you give up like 2 seconds after, you have a thread hanging around waiting for a connection timeout. So each request is one thread, and one thread is processing everything, reading the data, running the business logic, writing the output. Simple. In a reactive, so a non-blocking or even loop style, it's completely different. You only have a smaller amount of threads, usually close to the number of cores of the server machine, right? So you're using only the thing that you can truly do in parallel. Actually, it's the number of core -1. -1 is for the selector thread. And rather than having one thread doing all the work for a request, you actually have that interleaved, depending on the load of the server. So that thing, which is very smart, it's key in the even loop approach, is basically distributing work. And rather than you having to wait for a slow client to be able to read, or having to wait to write, because the network of the client is super slow, you can do many things in parallel for many different requests. So you don't have to wait anything. That's the base approach with reactive. So that has an impact on your programming style. I'm going to show you that in a minute. Very quickly. Regular style, servlet-based MVC, you write this. So you write some code. When that line is gone, when that line has returned, so basically the remote service, the remote database gave you the info, then you can do something, and if something goes wrong, then you put a try catch and everything works, right? And on the right, your repository, you basically pass stuff and you get stuff. And if it's slow, it blocks. Okay? Reactive style, functional style, you don't do that. You define a pipeline. So you define you define the logic. You don't define in an imperative way, where you get information, you pass information to something else. You define what should happen, and you see that the return type also changes. So rather than giving you the information that you want, it gives you a promise of the information. It gives you, I shouldn't use promise, by the way, because it's the wrong word, but it gives you a publisher. It gives you something that eventually will give you the data. I'm going very quick. We can discuss about that later. I'm going to skip that, even though it's super important. Basically, that slide is describing what happens between the thing that provides the data and the thing that wants the data. So that thing is, for instance, the driver of your MongoDB store. Gives you a publisher. And that thing is your code. You actually want the person to do something next. So you subscribe to the thing that will give you the person. And the way it works, it works in such a way that the resources of the server are optimized. And there is a specification that's called reactive streams. The specification is this. So it's very simple. It's only 4 interfaces. And the reason why this exists is because all those initiatives, like the Mongo driver, like Spring, like Netty, like something else, they need at some point a common API to talk to each other. And the common API is this. Okay, I'm going to skip this because otherwise that's going to take too long. What does that mean for Spring? Basically, what that means for Spring and Spring Boot 2, Spring Framework 5 is you have a new way to define your application. You have a new way to define your business logic, more functional style. But everything else, we adapt to it. So if you look at this slide, if you've done a Spring MVC controller in the past, then you can notice plenty of things that you already use nowadays, right? Get mapping is new. It's simply an alias for request mapping. You can use that with the servlet stack as well. So these are controller actions, usual controller actions. The only thing that's a bit different is that the return types are different. So you return a publisher rather than the data. So the point I'm trying to make here is you can reuse all your knowledge of Spring, everything you know about Spring, developing web applications. You can learn something new, reactive programming, and then you can integrate that new knowledge, that new paradigm in everything that you already know about Spring. So you don't have to basically learn everything from scratch. Reactive comes with something quite interesting when you need to do multi-calls. So let's take this example of you need to provide a user to some service. And to provide a user, you need the GitHub information of the user and the Twitter information of the user. So what do you do in regular applications? You do a call to the Twitter API, a call to the GitHub API, you block, you wait. And when you get that information, you combine that and you return the object. The GitHub API may be down or slow, or maybe the connection will time out for some reason. You need to manage a thread pool to be able to do that in parallel. Otherwise, the other reason is to call the GitHub API first, get the data, call the Twitter API, then get the data and return the user. So that's really, really annoying. So if you've done that in the past with a servlet-based application with thread pool and completable feature and everything, you know that it's actually quite complicated to do that. If you use reactive, the good news is that you basically describe what you need to do and you apply operators. So this will give you a GitHub user, this will give you a Twitter user, so that's pretty straightforward, right? No need to explain this. And then you use an operator. When those two are there, just execute this. And everything that's related to, you can actually add operators if you want to retry a few times if it fails, for instance. But everything that's related to asynchronicity, getting back the result and giving you a callback with the result, all that is done by the library automatically. The library is called Reactor, by the way, which is an implementation of reactive streams. So I'm going to conclude with this. This is what you know from Spring Framework 4 and previous generations. The servlet container, the servlet API, easy. Then we've built Spring MVC on top. And there is the annotation model that you know if you build a controller with Spring. Okay? New in Spring Framework 5 and Spring Boot 2, is a new project called WebFlux, where you can, and that's really a unique proposition in Spring, in my opinion, is you can not only use that with a servlet container, but you can also use that with Netty or the native support in Undertow. So there's much more options for you. So if you want to use Spring with Netty, you can do so with Spring Boot 2. So what we've built is basically an abstraction on that based on reactive streams, right? And on top of that, Spring WebFlux. What we've also done is we've built a functional API, that's WebFlux FN. It's also a new feature in Spring Framework 5. You can use that in Spring Boot 2, which is an alternative as the annotation model. So if you want to build your route completely programmatically, where you define your routes and what the callback should do, you can use WebFlux FN. So if you want the full picture, with this new system, you can use the annotation model if you like. So exactly the same as I've shown in the slides. So only the return type changes, and we adapt to it. You can use a new system, which goes further in the functional API side of things. So the things that you're going to, the business logic that you're going to define will be kind of functional, quite functional even. And you can go further with WebFlux FN because you can even define your router using a functional API. And that's where Kotlin comes in, because Kotlin has excellent support for that kind of use case. And by providing a standard support for Kotlin, then if you want to go fully the functional route on the JVM, that's an option you can choose. There you go. Introduction to reactive in 10 minutes. Or if you want to see what the router function looks like, it looks like this, that you get an idea of what it. So you replace those annotations by this, and it will do the same. So it's the same thing with what I've explained with the security. Everything in one place. So rather than having annotations in several files, you can actually have that in a single place. You can have, by the way, you can have as many router functions as you want. So if you have separate pieces of your applications and you want that in separate files, you can do so. But you can also have everything in one file. And of course, the advantage of that technique is that you are completely in control of the priority. So we will execute those in priority. So if you want a certain route to be taken first because you don't want to mess with request parameters or whatnot, then you can express that programmatically. Right. I think I'm done. But I'm happy to answer any question you may have after. I'm not going to leave anytime soon. So please reach out. Please share your stories, anything that you would like me to cover a bit more. We can also get in touch asynchronously. So I'm on Twitter, by the way, if you want to talk to me on Twitter. And if you want to talk, if you're not on the Twitter generation, if you don't like that stuff, you just remove that, and that's my address email. So snicol@pivotal.io. It's the same as my Twitter handle. So if you want to reach out by email, please do so. I'm happy to discuss with you. Thank you very much. And thanks for watching.